Often when I come into the sanctuary, when all the lights are off, I'm especially aware of the shadows that fall upon the floor and the pews because of the sun shining through the stained glass windows. And depending on what time of day it is, that will determine how the shadows fall out upon the floor. Indeed, we are aware of shadows in our lives as we walk about, as we live in the world. When the sun beams down upon us, we often cast a shadow upon the ground. We've often used the phrase before to talk about someone who scares easily, that they're afraid of their own shadow. Well, in the 23rd Psalm, a very familiar passage to us, we read where the psalmist writes, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." The valley of the shadow of death. Well, death is not something that any of us like to talk about or have conversations about. We'd rather not talk about it at all. We'd rather talk about better things or happier things, not about dying, not about death. But here the psalmist talks about walking through the valley of the shadow of death. Well, that's a valley we all have to walk through, not just when we're dying, but all the days of our life. The shadow of death is cast upon us. We simply don't live forever. There comes a point when each of us leave this world. So that shadow is always being cast upon our lives. And that doesn't mean then we have to be afraid of our shadow or the shadow of death. But like the psalmist, we can walk through the valley of the shadow of death with confidence and assurance and hope, because we know that our lives are not determined by the shadows, but by the light. The light that God has brought into our lives through his Son, Jesus Christ, who said, "I am the light of the world." Because of this light, we see shadows differently, even the valley of the shadow of death. With death upon us, all of our lives, we can have the hope that death will never be the final word for our lives, that its shadow will not always be cast upon us, but that God's light will ultimately drive away all the shadows. That's good news, especially in a world where death is so prevalent, where death is a daily headline. We can know without a doubt that the shadow of death need not be feared because of a light that broke forth on an empty tomb on Easter. That light has forever altered how the shadows play out in our lives. They will change, they will reshape and resize as time goes by, but they will not overcome. The light will always be greater. So we don't have to be afraid of our shadow, nor the shadow of death. We can trust in God, in God's light, and God's love that will always be shining. God bless each of you.